if you're listening and you've ever thought about putting Proxmox on a Raspberry Pi, there are some hoops you have to jump through, but I was able to do it. So I started out with the Raspberry Pi 5 that my boss gave me. He gave it to his grandson for Christmas, and his grandson had like zero interest in electronics or computers. That's like my boss's thing. Grandson likes football and baseball, not computers. So he gave it back to his grandpa.
Time to disinherit him.
And his grandpa gave it to me. And it was a Raspberry Pi 5, 8 gigabyte. So he gave me that, case, and power supply, and a micro SD card too. Oh, and then the case came with a active cooler, a little fan and heat sinks and stuff.
Okay, I was gonna ask that. Yep.
Yeah, so I was like, I don't have any more pies. So I was like, yeah, I'll take it, see what I can do. So I remember reading about some guy that put Proxmox on the Raspberry Pi 4, but I read that you could put it on the Pi 4 or the Pi 5. So there's a guy, and I put all this in the show notes too, that made a Proxmox port for ARM, because Proxmox doesn't make an ARM version of their Proxmox hypervisor for servers, only x86. So this guy made the port. It's called Proxmox port on GitHub, and he's got a mirror for the repo. Oh, hey, Eric. We're just talking about my Raspberry Pi that was given to me, what I've done with it so far. So.
Oh, cool. Okay.
So I was able to put, so that the issue with it is, from the guides I've read, you want to use Raspberry Pi OS Lite 64-bit version, and that Raspberry Pi has their own installer. And so what's cool about it is you don't even need to put a micro SD card into the Pi anymore. It does a netboot over the network. So as long as you have it hooked up and you have some kind of storage on there that it can boot from, you just turn it on, and it's because the Raspberry Pi has UEFI now, so it has a BIOS, and it downloads the image and installs it for you. But the problem with that is that it doesn't give you the option to install it to a partition. It doesn't give you the option to only use part of a disk. It just installs everything and fills up the whole disk. So I had a SSD, NVMe M.2 SSD from a laptop, because I bought a hat for it, the M.2 hat, and I had one out of an old laptop, which I was still using, but I was like, I don't need to use it that bad. So I took the SSD out of it, 500 gigabyte, because that is the only short form factor one I had that would fit that hat, and put that on the hat. And then every time I try to install Raspberry Pi OS Lite, which is the server version, there's no desktop, it would fill up the whole disk. So I said, man, there's got to be a way to do this, because I only want about 16 gigabytes to install the OS, and I need to use the rest of the disk for VM and container storage for Proxmox. So what you have to do to save room on your disk is install it. I installed it to a micro SD card, a 16 gigabyte micro SD card, and then I DD'd that over to the M.2 drive, the 500 gigabyte M.2 drive, so that it only filled up 16 gigabytes of the drive instead of filling up the whole thing. And then I created just a Linux partition on it for the rest of it. So that gave me storage for containers and all kinds of other stuff. And I installed I put the M.2 back on the Pi and booted up, and it booted up just fine. Said 16 gigabytes of storage, Raspberry Pi OS Lite. And then there's a repo in the show notes where you can install Proxmox ports from, which is the ARM version of Proxmox. And so I installed that on the 16 gigabyte partition. And then when I fired up Proxmox, I looked under disks and I had a whole nother, 470 something gigabytes that I could do whatever I want to with. So Proxmox has a format called LVM thin provisioning, make a thin pool. And what's cool about this LVM format is that it only fills it up when blocks are written. So say you put say I put I don't know, just for an example,
dynamic storage allocation.
Yeah, 100 gigabyte VM or container on that storage. Well, it's not going to show up as 100 gigabytes taken up. It's only going to show up as however much actual data I have within that VM or that container. So you really want to use LVM thin within Proxmox. And the only way to get it is to have extra disk space after you install it. Because when you install the OS and Proxmox on top of it, it splits it into local storage, which is for, you could put like backups, or you could put ISOs, and you can put Linux container templates in there, but you can't put actual machines in there. And then the other part of the storage is for the OS itself. So 16 gigabytes is plenty for that. And then so that left me with the rest for containers and for virtual machines, which I probably wouldn't run a virtual machine on a Raspberry Pi Proxmox because it's not beefy enough, really. I mean, you could, but it wouldn't be great. So after I created the partitions and all that stuff, I created the rest of the disk to use as LVM thin, and then I started making Linux containers. They give you templates. Proxmox does, their repo. And so for some reason, I couldn't get the Debian templates to download. They wouldn't download. So I had to use Ubuntu server, which is not that much different, except for the snap components, but whatever. So I used Ubuntu server in Linux containers within the LVM thin LVM thin partition of the disk. And so I've got one, I'm using Linux container for Etherpad, and Etherpad works great. Chasm, I've been using Chasm on there, and Chasm's awesome. Joe mentioned it earlier, and it's basically a Dockerized desktop that you can access via a web browser. And so that's where I run Nicotine Plus and things like that. And I only gave it 1 gigabyte of RAM because I'm trying to save. I've only got 8 gigabytes to work with, and part of it has to go to the OS. And so the problem I was having with Chasm was anytime I would fire up a web browser like Firefox or Chromium or something, it would crash the web browser because it would eat up all the RAM. So I found a browser called Min, M-I-N, Minimal Browser, that still is able to run the modern web in the Raspberry Pi repos, actually. And they had an ARM64 port of it, and it works great. It's never crashed, even with only a gigabyte of RAM for the whole operating system. So I recommend Min browser. It can still run all the modern web features, JavaScript, whatever. So that's what I installed within Chasm, as well as Nicotine Plus. Another container I'm running is for searching, also spelled SEARXNG, SEARXNG. So that's my search engine. And then I have a Linux container for my Git repo. Git is a self-hosted Git repo. And then I made another Linux container for just different web tools that I was using within Unohost. Because also today I finally got rid of Unohost after I was able to move the web tools I wanted to Dockerize containers within a Linux container. So a few of those I want to talk about. Swifty, spelled SSHWIFTY. So this took the this took the place of shell in a box that I was using on Unohost. So it's just a browser-based terminal, except it's even more secure. So before, if you went to the URL, you were met with a terminal screen that, just like any other Linux terminal, Linux shell, that had login and that's your login and password, where this one has an authentication screen first that you have to type in your user and password before you can even get to a machine, and then you have to type in the IP address of the machine you want to SSH to, and then you're presented with the terminal in the browser. And I like that a lot better. Swifty, I recommend that. There's a Docker Compose file for that out there. Wallabag, I think we talked about that before. It's basically just a link bookmarker where anything you see that looks interesting, you can save your links to. It's the same concept as Pocket, which is the one that Firefox bought, and except it's self-hosted. And you can save web articles on there, and then it also has text-to-speech, so it can read them to you straight from the Wallabag app, and they have the phone app and stuff too. And then Glance. So I was using Miniflux as a feed reader, but I like Glance because it's not just for it's not just for text feeds. You can do video feeds, you can do audio feeds, you can do weather feeds, you can do whatever on there. It's pretty cool. So I've just started messing with that. And then I wanted a dashboard to hold all my apps where I could just get to them on one screen. And Heimdall is what I'm using. And that's on the Raspberry Pi in that same WebTools container. And it's pretty cool. I posted a screenshot in Element and the Matrix. If you're listening to this, join our Matrix and come see what we're talking about. And it's just a place that has all the shortcuts to all my web apps I'm hosting. But what's cool is a lot of times they'll accept API tokens too from whatever web app. So you can see them, like my image server will show like how much space I have on there, how many photos, how many videos within the little tab, and just things like that that are neat little touches. It will show what repos are active and stuff. And so I recommend Heimdall, Heimdall. And currently, and so I was also able to add the Proxmox on Raspberry Pi to my Proxmox cluster too. So it's all part of my cluster with my x86 machines. So I've got 3 machines in there. I've got the Raspberry Pi, my big server, and then the little Lenovo proxy server. And the Raspberry Pi with all that running on it is currently using about 5% of CPU and 3.34 gigabytes of 7.86 gigabytes of RAM. So I still got a lot of room on there that I could, especially RAM is what I was mostly thinking about. A lot of room I can put more apps, so that's quite a bit to run on a little Raspberry Pi in a hypervisor too. That shows you kind of how low memory footprint Linux containers are, how great they are. I think they're great. So that's the Raspberry Pi part. I recommend this to if you're not like in a production environment, because it's not really production ready. I've noticed some things, like I had a backup issue on there where on Proxmox I back up everything to their Proxmox backup server, PBS. It's another operating system you can install, which is basically Debian with PBS on top of it. And it's just a backup storage solution that makes it really easy to back up containers and VMs from a Proxmox server. So the Raspberry Pi will not back up to the Proxmox backup server. It starts it, and then I get an error message, and I'm pretty sure it's because it's trying to back up from an ARM system to an x86 system, and there's some kind of incongruence between Proxmox ARM port and the official Proxmox backup server. So what you can do is what I did, is I just got a little SSD in a case and hooked it up via USB 3 on the Raspberry Pi, a 1 terabyte SSD, and you can plug that into your Pi, and Proxmox will see it as a disk, wipe the disk and then choose to create or use the disk as what they call a directory. So directories can take containers, images, they can take ISOs, and they can also take backups. And so, but they can't take VMs and actual working containers. So that's my backup storage. That's 1 terabyte, and I was able to within Proxmox, I was able to run scheduled backups through the interface to back up to that little SSD. And then I'll probably have another one remotely too that I can send it over to too. So if you want to back up stuff on a Proxmox port on Raspberry Pi, you have to do something like that. You can't use the official Proxmox backup server. But I was able to get it worked out and figured out. So that's what I did with my Raspberry Pi. And I was really surprised at how capable it is of running in hypervisor and just kind of low, not very intensive, applications, containers, Docker, all that stuff. Like I said, the only real caveat is the backups, and for some reason I can't get Debian containers to work on there, but Ubuntu containers work just fine.
And you wanted to sell it.
I wanted to sell it, yeah. And all I invested was $12 on getting that little hat for it. And that PCI hat for M.2 is great. I mean, it's super fast. I didn't do a perf or anything on it, but I can tell that just from the I/O delay that Raspberry Pi shows within Proxmox, it's consistently below like 0.25%. So not even 1% I/O delay, which is, for those that don't know, is the time it takes for the CPU to catch, or for the storage to catch up to the CPU.
Now, how does that hat? Do you have to leave the Pi 5 naked, or what do you have for a case?
So I'm using an official Raspberry Pi case, but I cannot have the top on there because it won't fit. The top is what has the fan on there, and there's another top that came with it that doesn't have a fan. So I'm using he gave me the active cooler, which is like a heatsink with the fan on it that sits under the hat. So it cools all the components under the hat, but you still can't put the top on the case. So the case is on, it just can't have the top on there. So the little M.2 is sticking out of the top. But it's still not, it's not that vulnerable because the hat takes the place of the top of the case, I posted pictures of it in Matrix for you guys a while back when I first set it up, so you can kind of see what it looks like. So it's not bad, and it's really quiet, super low power, and yeah, man, I like it a lot. I mean, I wouldn't recommend it if you were just looking for a Proxmox host. You can buy a cheaper, more capable computer with more RAM for Proxmox and a small x86 machine. But if it was given to you, or you need what do you call the I/O pins, the GPIO, then yeah, give it a shot. It's been a great little box.
Well, I'm just wondering if going with the the NVMe hat would affect the desktop performance of the Pi.
I have no idea because I don't have a desktop on it. Just running Raspberry, what's it called? Raspberry Pi OS Lite. So it's just a server version.
Yeah, basically it's Debian.
And what's cool about the hat too is it has it fits over the GPIO pins, and then it has its own socket on top, so you can still access all the pins from the hat side. And through the Proxmox interface, when you look at updates, it pulls updates from Raspberry Pi as well as from Debian and Proxmox port. So it's pretty cool. There is an issue now. When I try to reboot it from the Proxmox interface, it won't reboot. So if I do a big update, I have to be here to manually turn it off and then turn it back on again, the Raspberry Pi itself.
You can't
Proxmox.
SSH in and reboot it.
I mean, that's what I do. Is
all right.
try and but it won't reboot. It won't shut down. Like when it's shut down, the Raspberry Pi actually has a light on it and a button. The Raspberry Pi 5 does to turn it off and on. And so you have to go in and actually push the button down for a few seconds until it turns itself off and then turn it back on. Now I'm sure that's purely because of whatever Proxmox doing on Debian, but yeah, it's running some kind of interference where you can't shut it down remotely or reboot it remotely. So just keep that in mind. If you don't do updates unless you're, especially kernel updates, unless you're close to it somewhere. But I have links to all those applications I mentioned in the show notes, and also the repo for Proxmox ports. So if you've got one, I say if you had at least 4 gigabytes of RAM at minimum, give it a shot because they have it for the 4 and the 5 Proxmox port. They actually they give a list of compatible devices on here, ARM devices. The ROC 64 is on there. I was surprised about that. Let's see. So Proxmox port, tested platform. Oh, no, I'm sorry, not the ROC 64, the ROC Pi. Also the Apple M series chips. The Vision 5.2 RISC-V 64 is on there, but that's in early stages. An ARM 64 AM Logic TV box. And then whatever that Lung Song, the Chinese CPU, you know, they created their own, the one that RMS was talking about. He likes to use. It's open. Ampere servers, like what Oracle runs.